Hello. Thank you. Hopefully someone will be joining us shortly. Welcome to the very first Lunchtime Live here at the Charles Dickens Museum. So we're going to do this every week, every Monday at lunchtime at midday, just to give you a sense of inspiration on your lunchtime, allow you to sort of sit back and listen to the words of Charles Dickens wash over you. Dickens is an extraordinary writer, not just for his stories, which are, always pretty good, but the way he writes is so glorious. It can be funny, it can be tragic, it can be poignant. He's a poet in many ways. I mean, not strictly speaking, but it's a really poetic language. And I think sometimes in the hustle and bustle of modern life, sometimes it's lovely to just sit down, close your eyes, and hear the magic of his words. So we're going to do this every Monday at 12 o'clock. I'm sitting here in Charles Dickens's house. This is the morning room of the Charles Dickens Museum. So this is where he lived. This room would have been used mostly by his wife, Catherine, but you can see Charles and Catherine on the wall above me there. So because I'm sitting in Charles Dickens's house, Doughty Street, we thought we'd begin with a story which he wrote, or at least partly wrote, while living here. And that was the Pickwick Papers, his first full novel. The Pickwick Papers isn't necessarily like a lot of his other stories. You think of a Dickensian book, you probably have quite a clear idea in your mind of what that might feel like. But the Pickwick Papers is so fun. It's funny, it's dramatic, it's adventurous. It's based around the character of Mr. Pickwick, who is this kind of middle-class, middle-aged gentleman, rather portly, and totally clueless. He is not streetwise. He doesn't really know how to get through life. He's a bit of a bumbling old fool, but he's really charming, really lovely, and very kind. And in this scene that I'm about to read, he accidentally gets engaged. How do you accidentally get engaged, right? Well, we're about to find out. Mr. Pickwick has met a young man called Sam Weller, and he's deciding to take Sam Weller on as his servant. But before he can do that, he needs to cross it with his landlady, Mrs. Bardell. So that's the scene, and this is what Dickens wrote. He paced the room to and fro with hurried steps, popped his head out of the window at intervals of about 3 minutes each, constantly referred to his watch, and exhibited many of the other manifestations of impatience, very unusual in him. It was evident that something of great importance was in contemplation, but what that something was, not even Mrs. Bardell had been enabled to discover. Mrs. Bardell, said Mr. Pickwick at last, as that amiable female approached the termination of a prolonged dusting of the apartment. Sir, said Mrs. Bardell, your little boy is a very long time gone. Why, it's a good long way to the borough, sir, remonstrated Mrs. Bardell. Ah, said Mr. Pickwick, very true, so it is. Mr. Pickwick relapsed into silence, and Mrs. Bardell resumed her dusting. Mrs. Bardell, said Mr. Pickwick, at the expiration of a few minutes. Sir, said Mrs. Bardell again, do you think it a much greater expense to keep 2 people than 1? La, Mr. Pickwick, said Mrs. Bardell, colouring up to the very border of her cap, as she fancied she observed a species of matrimonial twinkle in the eyes of her lodger. La, Mr. Pickwick, what a question! Well, but do you? inquired Mr. Pickwick. That depends, said Mrs. Bardell, approaching the duster very near to Mr. Pickwick's elbow, which was planted on the table. That depends a good deal upon the person, Mr. Pickwick, and whether it's a saving and a careful person, sir. That's very true, said Mr. Pickwick, but the person I have in my eye, here he looked very hard at Mrs. Bardell, I think possesses these qualities, and has, moreover, a considerable knowledge of the world, and a great deal of sharpness, Mrs. Bardell, which may be of use to me. La, Mr. Pickwick, said Mrs. Bardell, the crimson rising to her cap border again. I do, said Mr. Pickwick, growing energetic, as was his wont in speaking of a subject which interested him. I do indeed, and to tell you the truth, Mrs. Bardell, I have made up my mind. Dear me, sir, exclaimed Mrs. Bardell. You'll think it very strange now, said the amiable Mr. Pickwick, with a good-humoured glance at his companion, that I never consulted you about this matter, and never even mentioned it, till I sent your little boy out this morning, eh? Mrs. Bardell could only reply by a look. She had long worshipped Mr. Pickwick at a distance, but here she was, all at once, raised to a pinnacle to which her wildest and most extravagant hopes had never dared to aspire. Mr. Pickwick was going to propose. A deliberate plan, too. Sent her little boy to the borough to get him out the way. How thoughtful, how considerate. Well, said Mr. Pickwick, what do you think? Oh, Mr. Pickwick, said Mrs. Bardell, trembling with agitation, you're very kind, sir. It'll save you a good deal of trouble, won't it? Said Mr. Pickwick. Oh, I never thought anything of the trouble, sir, replied Mrs. Bardell. And of course, I should take more trouble to please you then than ever. But it is so kind of you, Mr. Pickwick, to have so much consideration for my loneliness. Ah, to be sure, said Mr. Pickwick. I never thought of that. When I am in town, you'll always have somebody to sit with you. To be sure, so you will. I am sure I ought to be a very happy woman, said Mrs. Bardell. And your little boy, said Mr. Pickwick. Bless his heart, interposed Mrs. Bardell with a maternal sob. He too will have a companion, resumed Mr. Pickwick. A lively one, who'll teach him, who'll be bound more tricks in a week than he would ever learn in a year. And Mr. Pickwick smiled placidly. Oh, you dear, said Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick started. Oh, you kind, good, playful dear, said Mrs. Bardell. And without more ado, she rose from her chair and flung her arms around Mr. Pickwick's neck, with a cataract of tears and a chorus of sobs. Bless my soul, cried the astonished Mr. Pickwick. Mrs. Bardell, my good woman, dear me, what a situation! Pray consider. Mrs. Bardell, don't! If anybody should come. Oh, let them come, exclaimed Mrs. Bardell frantically. I'll never leave you, dear, good, kind soul. And with these words, Mrs. Bardell clung the tighter. Mercy upon me, said Mr. Pickwick, struggling violently. I hear somebody coming up the stairs. Don't, there's a good creature, don't. But entreaty and remonstrance were alike unavailing, for Mrs. Bardell had fainted in Mr. Pickwick's arms. Well, there you have it, a scene from Charles Dickens's novel showing how you can accidentally get engaged. Now, I won't give the plotline away. It comes back to haunt Mr. Pickwick. In fact, he ended up in court over this scene. So if you're interested in finding out more, pick up a book, read the Pickwick Papers. But if you don't want to pick up an entire book, don't worry about it. We'll be back here next Monday at midday for another little scene from one of Charles Dickens's stories. Have a lovely rest of your day.